Although never explicitly mentioned by name in early access, the Shadowfell is a plane of existence that we will likely have to deal with in Baldur's Gate 3. The druid Halsin does not use the term by name, but clearly refers to the place when talking about how to get to Moonrise Towers. Specifically, if you choose to go the as-yet unavailable mountain pass route to get there. He speaks of the Shadow Curse and the Shadowlands. Although I'm not 100% certain, I'm 99% certain he's speaking of some juxtaposition of the Shadowfell to the prime material plane, or perhaps even a merging of it. If that weren't enough proof, the most illustrious and esteemed Harbsnarps, Lord of Albion, has discussed data-mined files that are essentially proof of this. But what is the Shadowfell? And what could it mean for us in Baldur's Gate 3? As I've mentioned a number of times in discussing extraplanar matters, the material plane is surrounded in a sense by other planes of existence that represent different qualities that exist on the material plane, but are in fact embodied on other planes. For example, law and evil are embodied in the Nine Hells, and water is embodied on the plane of elemental water. There are even so-called para-elemental planes, such as the para-elemental plane of ice, sometimes called the Frostfell. And the Shadowfell, otherwise known as the plane of shadow, is technically similar, but rather than embodying the quality of shadow that also exists on the material plane, it can be seen as an echo of the material plane. But that hardly tells us what the plane is and what it's like to be there. Possibly unsurprising, the Shadowfell is a dark, dreary place, with a whiff of death and decay to it. The plane of shadow coexists with the material plane, touching it in all places, but only being accessible at night by way of certain spells and magic, such as the Shadow Walk spell. Sometimes temporary portals do appear, lasting a few days at most, and travelers who wish to risk it can use the Shadowfell as a shortcut to traverse great distances on the material plane, reappearing elsewhere on the material plane. More than anything else, the most striking feature of the Shadowfell is the complete lack of color and light. There is no sun, no moon, nor stars. Just a permanently inky black sky, and all objects appear as if they have had their color drained from them, leaving only black and white, which, on the plane of shadow, take on the hues of, oddly enough, dark black and light black, if such a thing can be imagined. Light sources are far less effective, and fire and flame produce less heat, and attempts to produce fire or light, whether magically or otherwise, are likely to fail, whereas conversely, magic and effects that promote darkness and shadow are significantly enhanced. And should in fact illumination succeed, it becomes visible at a far greater range than what it would achieve on the material plane, letting all know the source of the light. Because the Shadowfell is an eerie echo of the material plane, gravity and time function basically as they would on Faerun, and if you were to transport yourself to the Shadowfell, then you would basically enter the same terrain. A forest would still be a forest, and mountains would remain mountains, but they would differ in subtle, almost inexplicable ways. The Shadowfell is an echo of the prime material plane, but by no means a perfect one. To a certain extent, the plane of shadow is no more or less dangerous than the material plane, which is to say that the plane is not inherently damaging to most who travel it, with emphasis on the word travel. Unlike many other planes, such as the astral plane and the ethereal plane, there is sufficient food, though it's often dark in color and dripping black liquid similar to blood, and water, though it's ichorous and thick, and the air on the plane is normal, and a native of the material plane can survive for years on the plane without ill effect, once he gets used to the darkness and ever-present chill. However, denizens of the material plane who spend decades on the plane of shadow are in grave danger, as the plane of shadow is toxic to non-natives in the long term. Over time, such beings develop new abilities and vulnerabilities and even new forms, often in unpredictable fashion, and lose much of their former selves in the process. Despite the similarities, there are, of course, differences between the Shadowfell and the material plane. And one of these is the areas of the Shadowfell called the Darklands. Such areas of the plane of shadow have an affinity with the negative energy plane, and life-draining undead such as shadows, ghosts, and vampires all can be found in such patches in greater concentration. Visitors to these Darklands immediately feel the life force being leached from their bodies, and death and worse await any who stay more than a fraction of time, with only spells for protection against negative energy providing any safety in navigating these areas. As a partial reflection of the material plane, locations such as desecrated burial mounds, cemeteries, and haunted battlefields often have a Darkland echo in the Shadowfell. In the context of the Forgotten Realms, the goddess Shar is attributed with the creation of the Shadowfell, as distinct from the plane of shadow, which is to say, she gave it those qualities that make it the more dangerous place it is in contrast to the more neutral plane of shadow. even though they are frequently referred to as one and the same. After Shar and Cyric had succeeded in murdering the goddess Mystra in 1385 DR, Shar drew out some of the necrotic energies from the negative energy plane and injected them into the plane of shadow, creating the Shadowfell, and with this act it became a major source of power and influence for her. Not least because it was renamed the Shadowfell based upon her actions. So in principle, the Shadowfell refers to the plane of shadow after Shar's intervention, and the plane of shadow prior to her intervention. But where does the Shadowfell fit in for us as players in terms of the BG3 campaign? Halsin tells us of the different ways we might reach Moonrise Towers, though in early access only the Underdark is an option. But in more than theory, upon release there should be two options: the already familiar Underdark route, and the Risen Road, a stretch of road that connects the city of Baldur's Gate with Elturel, which requires us to travel through a mountain pass which is referred to as the Shadowlands by Halsin. He also speaks of the Shadow Cursed, who are presumably beings connected to the Shadowfell and the Shadowlands themselves, which threaten to turn you into a Shadow Cursed. And because actual data mine information has been found that uses the term Shadowfell by name, we know that it will almost certainly be in the game, and that we will interact with it, at least if we choose the Risen Road option, as there are other data mine sources that explicitly mention interactions involving Halsin, the player, and the Shadowfell. Beyond that, the description of the Shadowlands given by Halsin sounds like a merging of the planes, that is, of the Shadowfell in its worst areas, the Darklands, and the material plane, and the creatures he described clearly are some sort of undead. Whatever ritual was conducted here bound the two planes together, and strengthen the Darkland aspect of the Shadowfell more than the less deadly areas. The goddess Shar obviously plays a large, if indirect, role in the game, through Shadowheart as well as the Shadowfell, and Ketheric Thorm was a Dark Justiciar follower of Shar who fought against the druid Halsin. And it's interesting, because even though we've been directly told by Lorien that the so-called Dead Three, namely Bane, Merkel, and Baal, are behind the complot we are embroiled in, on the periphery, Shar seems to be as much of Bane, no pun intended, as the Dead Three are, if not more so, through Shadowheart, through the obstacles she's put in place as we try to reach our goal of resolution of the Tadpole Dilemma. Even Gale would naturally be at odds with her, because she helped murder his goddess Mystra. And then there's the question, what exactly does Shar or her clergy want with the Githyanki artifact? Which is all to say that Shar will be playing a very large role in the game, of that I'm sure. It seems inevitable that we're on a collision course with the Shadowfell, unless, of course, we choose the Underdark, and that's what interests me personally the most about all of this, as presumably the choice would be consequential enough that if we did choose one route over the other, we would miss out on all the items and NPCs we would otherwise acquire and talk to on one path. And not only that, seeing as how the game is shaping up, that which route we choose to take might have an impact on later interactions throughout the game, as well as the ending. For now, the Underdark route seems to be the simpler route, if you will. Sure, there are Minotaurs and Hook Horrors and Dwergar, but nothing too bad compared to potential undead from the Shadowfell. And then there's the question of whether or not Halsin accompanies us, which, based on his own statements, seems almost certain, at least if we choose the Risen Road route. Based on all this, I truly hope that Early Access is only the tiniest of sneak peeks into Chapter 1 and the rest of the game. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please comment, subscribe, leave a like, as it really helps out my channel a lot, and I will check you out later. Take care.